Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Getting the Most from Your Monitoring, Amazing Advanced Query Tips. Today our hosts are Gemma.
Hi, I'm Gemma. I head up the professional services team in Berlin, and we're responsible for ensuring clients in the dark regions get the best results from Brandwatch by providing tailored setup solutions.
And we're also joined by Nate.
Hi, I'm Nate Walton. I head up the professional services in the United States, and I do a lot what Gemma does. Really the core is making sure that social data is useful for businesses.
Today we're going to talk about queries and advanced tips for making your queries even better. This week we launched our new operators, which towards the end of the session we're going to talk about and show you how to use those. But first we're going to talk about testing your query and how you can do that to make it even more accurate. Then tips for removing spam, and then talking about how to write research queries rather than just brand queries. Then, as I say, we're going to talk about the new operators, and then we'll be answering your questions. So please feel free to ask us questions in the chat box, and then we'll get through those in the Q&A. You can also tweet us at Brandwatch and using the hashtag BrandwatchTips. And we'll be recording this webinar, and a copy of the presentation and the recording will be sent out after a couple of days. So over to you, Nate.
So, like Jasmine said, the first thing that I wanted to talk about today was testing your query. And this is a very important first step whenever you're writing a query. So before we start and dive in with some testing on specific queries, I just wanted to note a couple of things. The first is that I always start with queries as simply as possible. This allows me to incrementally build my queries and allows me to test every single step. So the second thing that I like to do is always check my results, and we'll jump into this in a second, but one of the key things that I'll note here is that we'll always be checking the last page of our search results. So when we're testing queries, there are two kinds of things that we usually want to tackle. The first is the concept of relevancy. So that would be data that's relevant versus irrelevant for the topic you're searching. And then the second aspect to query testing, which is quite important, is when you have volume that is too high. So that is volume that's a conversation that is too large to really manage, or is perhaps not necessarily targeted at your objective. So first, let's begin with relevancy. So here we are in Brandwatch. I'm just looking at my queries screen. This is where I'll create a brand new search. So I'll click New Queries. Okay, here we are in the free text search, which is where we use all of our Boolean language to find our relevant content. So today, let's just look for mentions of JP Morgan Chase. So that's Chase Bank. Now we could do a search for just JP Morgan, but that's pretty limited because a lot of people, of course, are always talking about Chase Bank. I went to Chase, I went to a Chase ATM, etc. So let's begin with Chase. So I always begin as simply as possible. So Chase, and I test my query. So a couple of key things to note here. The first is there are 327,000 mentions, give or take, for Chase in the last 8 days. And the second thing to note are the actual mentions here. So we see that there's some relevant mentions up front, but pretty quickly we can see that there are irrelevant mentions sneaking into our conversation. And this makes sense. People talk about chasing their dreams. There are sports teams that chase titles and all kinds of other things. So what I just did was I clicked to the last page of returned content. And this is useful because the system takes the most relevant information up front and sorts it, and that means that the most irrelevant or the most potentially irrelevant conversation according to the keywords you've put in your Boolean could come at the end. So it's always useful to check both sides. So we see that by the end we get to here where like car chases and people chasing each other away and all kinds of different things. Championship playoff and chasing different trophies, etc. So what do we need? We need a little bit more testing. So the first thing that we're going to try is some context. What I mean by that is what exactly Chase does. So let's try bank or banking or ATM. And of course we test again. And we've cut out about 250,000 mentions over the last week just by adding some of this context. So here we see, we review our mentions. Looks much cleaner in terms of conversation. Go all the way to the last. Up, Chase Bank, Chase Bank. Okay, so we still have some irrelevant conversation here, but it's much cleaner. So that's my first process step. Now, the flip side of inclusion keywords or context, positive context around my keyword chase, is to try exclusions. So sometimes it's a better tactic to, when I'm testing my query, instead of starting with context, to start with by excluding stuff that's potentially irrelevant. So let's flip back then. Let's take this away and let's do not. And then we have a couple of different things here. So we could have like chase streams, or chase title, or car chase. So this is a different tactic that we can take. And I just put a couple of keywords in, and then again I test. So you can see that, in fact, this is probably not the best strategy. My context keywords list are giving me much cleaner content. But let's just look at this for a second. I have about 322,000 mentions, which means we cut out only about 4,000 or 5,000 mentions with these exclusions, which is perfectly fine in terms of getting closer to where we need to be, but it doesn't give us that same kind of huge jump like we did with positive context. You can see here that already by the third mention, we still have some irrelevancy. Now, this is a very straightforward thing. You know, I can go here, chase Daniel, and continue to exclude and test and incrementally refine. But you know, it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, for 322,000 mentions, I just cut out another 100. I'll just keep incrementing. That's fine. Sometimes the best thing to do is to instead actually just try both. So that's when we have the positive context again and include our exclusions. So here we are. I just had that from before. So here we can see that I'm now doing chase and these keywords, but also excluding some of this irrelevant content. So let me test my query again. So here we've cut out a few more irrelevant mentions. I think we had a little higher in terms of 48,000 mentions. We've cut out a few extras, and we have some nice, decent context keywords. So one quick note I'll make about this is that generally we'd start with and, because always simplest is best, but we'd recommend moving into our proximity. The reason for this is just because proximity, especially proximity near 15 or near 20, tells the system that chase needs to be within more or less of a sentence of these concepts. And the reason that is important is because it just helps tighten up that relevancy in terms of whether people are discussing chase within the context of banking rather than having a, like mentioning a bank at the top and a car chase at the bottom, for instance. So as I incrementally test, it's always really important to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on the different keywords I'm adding and subtracting. And this comes back to the second layer of testing, which is always test in segments. So you can see earlier I was adding and removing exclusions and adding and removing context. It's always really helpful to figure out how to dial in that relevancy. So here, for instance, I'm working along, and let's say I add the keyword money. I'm just adding a single keyword and testing and adding a single keyword and testing. And when I do chase near money, I can see that this jumps. Now, let's see if that's relevant. Again, I always go to my least relevant conversation. JP Morgan Chase, JP Morgan Chase. There's a less relevant piece of information. So you can see that money is actually adding a little bit of a relevancy for this. So people talking about chasing money. So chase is both a relevant keyword because Chase Bank obviously deals with money, but people also chase money colloquially. And so we have a bit of an issue there. Just as a final point about query testing, is that if I save this off, sometimes I can take great advantage of my dashboard to actually help me additionally review and test my query. So I just saved my query, so I just click save, got a little bit of data here. I'm just going to view this in a completely default Brandwatch dashboard. So here we have summary. I'll click over to the topics component, and I find the topics component really useful for that kind of relevancy analysis. So you can see here, for instance, that JP Morgan Chase is obviously a very relevant piece of conversation, but we also have this chase money topic here. And if I click to view the mentions, it's going to give me a little bit of insight into why that's not necessarily relevant conversation. And a quick note is I can always click over here as well in my filters and jump directly back to my query if I wanted to keep editing it with any of the insights I derived from my topics cloud. So that's a little bit about testing for relevancy. Now the question is if you test for volume, so say you have a very, very high volume query and you need to work to reduce it. First, try everything that we just talked about for relevancy. Really make sure you've nailed down that conversation in terms of making sure that it's relevant to the brand or product, just in case there's any ambiguity. The other thing that I would say is, and let's use a different example here, make sure that you are focusing specifically on your objective. So let's take iPhone, for instance. Do a little test for this. We're looking at about 2.5 million mentions for iPhone over the last week. So that's a lot of mentions. Now, I could save this off and I could struggle through all 2.5 million mentions if I was able to, all of that different kind of thing. But really, maybe it's the question of the objective is something different. So let's say, for instance, that the question is, and here I'm testing again, how people are comparing the iPhone to other products on a feature function level or a purchase level or something else, right? So it puts a bit of context, it puts a bit of information around that purchase decision making or however you come at this angle. But you can see that I fell from 2.5 million mentions down to about 100,000. So already this gets 25 times more manageable. And then what if it turns out that we really are doing that like feature function comparison and the other comparisons is take an extra step and think about what kind of conversation additionally that might be required in those things, in those kinds of specific conversations, which might be verse or versus or compare. And here I'm just using a wildcard, which indicates that I can do compare, comparison, comparing, anything on the end. And I test my query again, and I'm down to about 7,000 mentions from 2.5 million mentions a week. So that's just an extra step in terms of managing volume. Test and test and test, and test as you get closer to your objective, and sometimes you can really cut back on the total volume that you have. So that's testing your query. A quick note about what we were working through with Chase is that you can think about that conceptually as the total volume of conversation you're looking for versus what your actual query is bringing back. So I just wanted to note here, I'll just note on the right-hand side, you can see that there's this white circle is all actual JP Morgan Chase conversation. And when we start to play with keywords like Chase, we pull in all of that conversation, of course, but we also pull in additional conversation. The key here to remember is just that when you start to add context and you start to add exclusions, you can really tighten up that relevancy. But there's always a tension between relevancy and the total actual conversation you're pulling back. It's actually okay and very often preferable to make a small sacrifice for the odd mention that you might accidentally exclude in favor of just really tightening your query down and making sure you're getting good relevant content. So let's talk about tips for removing spam. Unlike relevancy, spam is pretty easily identifiable as just garbage sometimes. So you can see up on the top that we're looking at, and this is a little bit small, but we're looking at just an absolute slew of keywords, and this is just keyword stuffing and link spamming. So here we have a whole bunch of different keywords around Gucci and Prada and other luxury and jewelry brands, etc. Also, we have a bunch of links. And at the bottom here, we have another instance of spam. This is a bit trickier. So this is where this spam robot or this spam blog scraped or stole a whole news article directly from another source and then just inserted these annoying keywords, Burberry store locator, multiple times into that legitimate content. So it's a bit trickier and more complicated than this straight keyword stuffing. Of course, we also have these kinds of spam. So we have the Twitter, classic Twitter and Facebook spam bots. So on the left, we have a Twitter bot that's just blasting out links to eBay bids. And then on the right, we have a whole bunch of keywords and other content just being blasted onto Facebook with a call to action here to see this deal. So these different kinds of spam sort of educate us about how we can tackle removing this from our queries. So a quick note before we get into some of the tactics. Spammers generally target these industries more: fashion, automotive, pharma, cosmetics, and finance. And that is to say that these are generally aspirational brands. So brands where people would love to own this, like a piece of Tiffany & Co. jewelry or something like that. And they're also generally consumer brands. So when you get a brief or you know that you're going to start searching for that kind of content, just know that up front that it's going to get a bit trickier on the spam side, and so be prepared for that, aspirational and consumer. Certainly Brandwatch does some work on the back end to eliminate the more egregious elements of this, but of course it's always a balance between what you let through and what you accidentally exclude, like we were talking about on the relevancy layer as well. So it is a bit of a tricky problem to take care of automatically. So just know that when you get to these brands, sometimes it gets a bit trickier. So what do we do about that? Instead of targeting individual authors or sites, like excluding that Tory Black Twitter handle, for instance, and then excluding the next handle, the next handle, and the next handle, Instead, exclude on the basis of language. So for instance, inappropriate language. So certainly if you're doing a search for Viagra, Viagra is not inappropriate, but if you're doing a search for car insurance or something, Viagra is very easily becomes an exclusionary keyword. Actual aspirational and consumer brands, if you're not tracking them, like Air Jordans, and of course like pornography in the whole world that entails. Calls to action. So like we saw with the Facebook posts, go ahead and exclude those, see deals, click now, all those other aggressive calls to action that you usually see in that kind of content where people are trying to link bait people into clicking into a link to like go to an Amazon store page or something like that. Aggressive language. So all caps is kind of a rude thing to do on the internet, but very often you'll see that spam bots and other things are trying to capture your attention by using all capitalizations. And it can even be as simple as sometimes an all capitalized version of your brand or product name. If it's all capitalized, it's probably a spam bot blasting that out, whereas a normal person would just type it all lowercase or just capitalize the first letter. So you can go ahead and use raw to actually exclude that. I'll show it in a second. Excessively repeated words like deals, 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 or buy, 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 etc. I'll show how you can exclude that in a second, but spammers love to repeat those keywords. Authors with odd names like user, admin, 2 underscores in front of iPhone, all of that, very safe to exclude as well as spam. And reseller language, like we saw with the Twitter bot, requests for bids, actual usage of the $sign, etc. These are things that we found that regular users on social media don't necessarily aren't hugely prevalent, but amongst spam bots and amongst spam, it happens all the time. So let me just show how we use raw, and we use a particular proximity trick to deal with aggressive language and repeated words. Let's go over to iPhone again. iPhone, test our query. So let's go hunting for some spam. So the first kind of spam that we're going to go hunting for is the shouty cap spam. So here you can see that we use the raw operator, which says this to Brandwatch that we're only looking for this kind of capitalization, raw, so all caps sale. And so you can see that this very quickly allows us to target all of these very aggressive Facebook posts, which are clearly repeated, which are obviously spam. And if we wanted to turn it around, we could exclude those. Obviously, in the greater iPhone conversation, that's sort of a drop in the bucket, but that's a very, very direct way of excluding that raw conversation, or that all caps conversation. And you can actually be quite aggressive with this for excluding spam. Like I said, you can use product and brand names very often. If they're all capitalized, they're 90% of the time they're also spam. And let's do something else. Let's try deals, deals, deals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tilde proximity operator. And what this says is deals, deals, deals has to be, these 3 deals have to be within 100 keywords of each other. So there's some deal spam. So free shipping, 15%, 25% off. You can also see that when you hunt for spam, you can very often find other ways of excluding spam as well. So it's never always a bad thing about just going for an exclusion. Take a look at how the spam comes in through your query. And then, of course, we can go ahead and turn this around and test again. So again, this deals, deals, deals with tilde proximity, as we refer to it, is really effective. This doesn't work with near, so just as a quick point is near is useful for other things, but near will match, kind of go back and match itself. So always use the tilde proximity when you're trying to do this trick about repeated keywords inside of spam to exclude it. And that concludes the conversation about spam. So now I'd love to turn it over to Gemma.
Cool, thanks a lot, Nate. So in the last part of today's webinar, I'm going to start off and talk to you about research queries, explaining what they are, giving steps to construct them, and going over a couple of examples. Then lastly, we're going to look at the new operators launched this week and test how they work in Brandwatch. So what exactly is a research query? Well, a research query can be constructed similar to your brand searches, but instead of looking for brands, you can look for any topic you choose. So there's just a few of the many examples there that you could search for. So you can use them to search for a topic, or you could use them to pick up particular mentions, say from a particular group of people, like people looking for holidays online, etc. So that you can then analyze or target the mentions that get returned. So what are the uses for research queries? Well, first of all, you can do market analysis with them. So finding out what hot topics for a particular market or industry are, who are the top influencers, where are the key pages, channels where they're conversing. You could also use the data from a research query for a report. And you can even use research queries as early warning indicators. So if there's a particular topic that's could be quite damaging to your business, then you can set up a research query to find out if it's being talked about online and be alerted when that suddenly increases so that you can then inform the business from the results. There are so many uses that you can do with research queries. And on the next couple of slides, we're just going to look at a couple of research queries that I've set up before. So the first one is this string here was set up to capture mentions from people talking about commuting in London. So the objective of that was to pick up mainly London commuters where possible. And then from the results, I wanted to find out what are the popular forms of transport discussed online, what are the frustrations of people commuting within London, and then are there any other creative ways that they're using to get to work? So it's quite topical at the moment because we've got tube strikes happening in London. So just to explain this string, I'm going to miss the first paragraph to start with and go into the second part. So in here, you can see this is where I've added terms for different ways that people might commute, different modes of transport. And then below that, I've linked in close proximity. So Nate talked about the proximity operator before. I've linked that then closely to the terms to or from, and then close proximity again to terms for work, job, or office. And then lastly, I've then added my term for London, of course, because I wanted to pick up specifically London commuters. And then I've also added other places within London because people won't necessarily say that they're just traveling to work in London. They might say locations within London. And then the first section, I've added in some personal pronouns, as you can see, and then linked this all together with the rest of my search. And what this does is this enables me to then pick up mainly where people are talking about commuting in London. So then I can cut out if there's any other kind of advertising or marketing type noise that I'm not really interested in. Using the personal pronouns will pick up where somebody has said I, and then in relation to the terms for commuting in London. Then the last part that I want to talk about in this string is you'll see that at the very bottom, I've actually repeated the top part, but instead of linking it to terms for locations within London, I've actually used a location operator. So I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail when we go into the app shortly. But basically what this part does is picks up where somebody might be tweeting about commuting to work, but they might not specifically say where they work. So therefore, we can pick up tweeters that are tweeting within London about going to work. Of course, we might pick up some tweets there where somebody is tweeting in London and they work outside of it, but I'm not too worried about that. You're going to get some results maybe that aren't as accurate, but it is definitely going to broaden the capture with your search. So what are the steps to writing a good research query? Well, first and foremost, like I did with the commuters example that I just showed you, it's really important to define the search objective. And even asking yourself a few questions like what you want to answer from the results can really, really help you to get that search objective. But then also be prepared to be flexible according to what you might find. So as you start writing your string, you might have a set objective in mind, but then as you start creating the string and seeing the results that get returned, they might not match exactly what you were hoping for. So be a bit flexible with that objective. Make sure that you research the topic before you even go into Brandwatch. Go on Google, search for it, find out where the top sites where it's being talked about and what terms and language are being used to talk about it. Then when you go in to actually construct and test your query string in Brandwatch, make sure that you give yourself a decent amount of time to test it. As Nate said before, just test as you're going along and constructing your query, and just every time make sure that the type of results that are returning are what you were expecting. Always make sure you review a good proportion of results, again reiterating what Nate said before, And then it's always really useful to then, once you're happy with your actual string and you save it, to then go in and check the mentions in a dashboard as well. If you're going to be using the results from your research query as part of a market analysis or as part of a report, and you really want a good, clean pot of data to analyze, then be prepared to make manual exclusions within the dashboard itself. So I would say with research queries, it's better to cast a broader net, or cast your net wider, sorry, so that you capture a broader range of mentions around the topic. And then don't worry too much if you see the odd irrelevant mention, because you can just go and exclude them within the dashboard itself. If you're seeing, say, a big proportion of irrelevant mentions, then you know that you probably should go back in and work on your query. But I would say sort of the odd one or two within 100 is fine. I would accept that as a good query string. Then consider adding personal pronouns, so to capture those personal mentions, as I showed you in the London commuters query. And then also consider adding in thinking terms for opinions. So if you're specifically looking at a topic where you want to know people's thoughts and opinions about it, adding in terms like thought, consider, think, etc. can really help you get to those opinionated mentions. So now we're going to go into the app itself and actually just construct a quick research query. So for this one, with summer just around the corner, I thought we could do a research query looking for people that are wanting recommendations about holiday destinations. And for this, we're going to use mainly only Twitter. And you can see here are a couple of the types of tweets that we're hoping to capture with this query string. So if we go into the app, as we don't have too much time left, I have actually gone in and created part of the string already. So just to explain what's happening, in this first section here, I've added in the terms for advice or recommend or tips or opinion, etc. So the types of things that people might say when they're looking for advice. And then I've linked that in near proximity to different terms for holidays. So vacation, holiday, short break, getaway, mini break, etc. And then lastly down here, I've linked it to Twitter because we just want to look at those tweets. So if we test this query, and just while we're waiting for the results to return, just to point out some useful things within the query builder to help you if you get stuck while you're constructing your queries. So if you click on the list of operators here, you will see all the available operators. So we have about 22 now in the system for you to use to help construct your queries. So in here you will get brief descriptions of what each of the operators do. But then you also have extra links here and then down at the bottom if you need any more tips and advice on how to construct your queries. So let's go back. So here we can see that we are getting some good mentions returning. They definitely look as though they're matching my search objective of picking up people wanting advice on holidays. But there are the odd one or two that look as if they are advertising type mentions, so it's not from a personal perspective. So let's pop in those pronouns, so I or my or me. When you're writing research queries, you'll often find that if you're adding in lots of different ways that people might refer to the topic, that you actually need to use quite a few search nestings or groupings within your string. So you can start getting having quite a few brackets going on in your search. If you ever get lost as to what your brackets are doing, you can actually highlight on a bracket to see which one corresponds to it. So this can really help you keep track of them. I also really find that adding spacing in your query strings as well, so between sections like I've done here, can help you understand what's going on a lot easier and also help you to keep track of those brackets as well. So now if we test these results with the pronouns, what we see returning is we have less of a volume. As before, it's cut the volume in half, but we see that we're getting much more relevant results for our search. So these are people looking to go on vacation. And this kind of query could be really useful, say, for somebody working in the travel industry that maybe wants to target these holiday seekers and promote to them, or just to do some analysis on what types of things they're asking. So there are endless types of research queries that you can create in Brandwatch, and following the steps I've just shown you will hopefully help you get to the good results. In my opinion, I think setting them up alongside your brand searches in Brandwatch can really help enhance what you're doing with social media monitoring. And research queries can provide some really useful insights that you can direct back into your business. For the last part of the webinar, we're going to look at the new operators launched this week. So I'm a complete query geek. I love writing queries, and I love the fact that Brandwatch has so many different operators available to construct them. So I was very excited when these were launched. 2 new operators were launched this week. I'm sure now that most of you will have heard which operators they are, as we've been singing about them from the rooftops. But for those of you that haven't, they are @mentions and hashtags. So the @mentions operator enables you to pick up mentions from people contacting a specific Twitter handle. This is not to be confused with the Twitter handle tweeting themselves. @mentions will only pick up people contacting them. If you want to pick up the Twitter handle themselves, then you would need to use the author operator. And I'm going to show you that in a sec. And then the hashtags operator does exactly what it says on the tin. This operator picks up hashtags that are being used on Twitter, Instagram, and other platforms. So let's see how they work in Brandwatch. For this example, we're going to use Target. So Target have the Twitter handle @Target, and they also promote a hashtag Target finds, and it's mainly used for people that are finding interesting products in Target and then tweeting about them, and Target encourage them to use this hashtag. So we're going to go back into the app, and we're going to look at @mentions to start with. So previously, to pick up somebody contacting a Twitter handle, you would have had to use the raw operator. So Nate explained this before with his demonstration. And then you would have had to add every possible way that people might write the Twitter handle. So @Target like this, this, and this. And then if we test the results, we can see that we're not specifically picking up people contacting their Twitter handle. We're also picking up where people have written perhaps @Target just in on another page type, but it's not specifically to contact them on Twitter. So I'm just going to add in Twitter and then see what results we get back then. So here we are getting those Twitter mentions, but as we scroll further down, there are some irrelevant tweeters, or people contacting other @Target authors on Twitter, but where they might have something else written afterwards, so not as accurate. But now what we can do with the @mentions operator, this simplifies this all down, and all you need to do is type @mentions followed by the Twitter handle name without the @. That's very important to not include that. And then if we test it, we can see that now we've got results of people specifically contacting the Target handle, and we're not seeing those mentions on other sites, and we're not seeing the tweets that were to other people that have Target in their Twitter handle. So that's how that one works. And then just to quickly go in and show you the hashtags. So similarly to how we would pick up people contacting a Twitter handle before, you would use the raw operator to pick up hashtags. And then you would have to include all the case versions, obviously, because raw is case sensitive. So now with the new hashtags operator, you just simply have to write hashtags followed by the hashtag, making sure that you don't include the actual hash symbol. And there you go, and then you get all your results back. So just to quickly show you how you would add this in maybe to a Target query where you're picking up all mentions, or you want to pick up as many different mentions about Target. So Target is obviously an ambiguous term on its own, so we have to link it with context terms. This is a really shortened version of the query that you would need to really optimize this search, but this is just what I put together to show you for the webinar. So here you would have include your terms for picking up general mentions of people talking about Target stores online or website. And then here we would pick up where people are contacting the author Target. And I've added site Twitter here because there are other authors who use the name target, but they're not specifically the brand authors. So I've linked that to Twitter. And then at the bottom here, I've added people contacting, picking up where people are contacting target's Twitter handle, and then also where they're using those hashtags. Before, I did actually say to you that I was going to show you the locations operator as well. So if we wanted to specifically add in here where people were tweeting from or talking about target from a specific location, what you can do is click here on locations, and then you can write your location in here. So say we wanted to look at people talking about target in New York, for example. You just type your location in there, and then you get your code down at the bottom, and then you just have to simply add it into your strings. So we group this whole section off together, and then say and then add in our code there, and then this should pick up people talking about target specifically in New York. Great. So in summary, the new operators make it much quicker and easier to build queries. They're not case sensitive, so you don't have to worry about potentially missing something because you haven't written in every case version. They make your searches more accurate. They can also be used in rule strings as well. So all of the operators that are supported within Brandwatch, you can also use them in rules. We don't have time today to go into rules in much detail, but you can find out more about that by going in the help and support section within the app if you haven't set any up before. They're essentially mini queries that you can set up within your main queries. So if you had that master query about target, and then within it you wanted to pull out specifically where the hashtag is mentioned, then you could use a rule to do that. And finally, they just make our searches even more powerful. So they bring our total number of Boolean operators available up to 22, which is really great for making good, relevant searches. So thanks a lot for listening, and thank you for sticking with me through to the end.
Great, thank you, Gemma. So we're just going to go through some of your questions now. If you don't want to stick around for questions, I'm aware we're running over a little on time. We have got a Q&A on Twitter tomorrow, so if you use the hashtag Brandwatch tips again from 3 p.m. UK time or 10 a.m. Eastern time, then you can ask us anything about particular operators or best practice or a particular issue you're working through, and we'll answer you there. We've also got a masterclass coming up in New York, which has lots of a whole day full of sessions with how-tos and advice, and some of those are about queries. You can sign up via the link shown on screen. But let's get to some questions. Several people have been asking about near, what the difference between and near is, and also how to choose the number for near, so whether that's near 20, Gemma, you're using near 2, sometimes it's near 50. Gemma, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that if you're linking, if you have like an ambiguous brand like Target, for example, then of course you need to link it with context terms. And using the near operator over and is going to get your brand terms and then your context terms that you're adding in a lot closer together. And I really like using near 15. I find through years of writing queries and testing the results that I get the most relevant kind of results when I'm linking ambiguous brands and context with near 15. But you can definitely play around with it. Like near 15 is a good place to start, and then maybe try it further away and just keep checking the relevancy of the results that are returning. As the relevancy gets less accurate, then tighten it up and make your near closer together. And then also if you're looking for, so in the London commuters example where I wanted to pick up people talking about going to or from work, I used near to there because I wanted those terms to be closer together, but I also wanted to leave space in case somebody says traveling to my work or to the office and so on. So having near to means that we would always also pick up where other words could appear between them.
And we've also used like near to F before with the addition of the letter F after. Do you want to explain what that does?
Yeah, so basically the F will say that whatever the term is ahead of the near F has to be forward of the following term. So it basically depicts the direction of where the terms would appear. So without the F, you could pick up either of the terms either side of each other, but with near F in the middle, it will be the one to the left side. The terms to the left side would always come before the ones in the right side of the nesting.
Great. And Aaron has asked, can you use that near operator for author and raw?
With the raw operator, you can only use the near if you raw both sides of your nesting. So basically, if you had raw Sky Plus, for example, because you wanted to pick up the plus symbol, then you want to link it with context terms, so say you wanted Sky Plus box or receiver, then you would need to raw the other side, your context terms as well. Otherwise, just use it with and in that case. And then with author, because the author is attached to the whole mention, you don't need to link it with near. So the author is actually metadata that's applied to every single mention. So because we don't search for the author within the context, the text body, then you can't near proximity it to any terms. Great.
And Nate, you use the proximity tilde operator with tilde 100. Could you explain a bit what that tilde operator actually does?
Yeah, definitely. So the tilde operator works a lot like proximity. So the simplest way to think about it is if I had, say I had love and iPhone, and I did love near 20 iPhone, then the tilde operator would be the same. It would just be love and iPhone inside those quotation marks, followed by a tilde and a 20, so 20. And so that's the most straightforward sort of comparison. The reason that it gets really useful for the deals spam exclusion, for instance, is because you can ask it to look for the same keyword over and over again, and you can say that it should be deals 3 times or deals 4 times, etc. And so that's when you get to that point where the tilde operator works more like this keyword needs to be within 100 characters or 100 words of this keyword, which needs to be in 100 words of this keyword, which needs to be 100 words in this keyword. And you can see how that's much more useful than trying to write it out with near proximity, because it just starts to string them all together. The other thing I would say about tilde is that it's also very useful for flexibly matching phrases. So like a little bit what Gemma was saying is maybe this helped also for thinking about different use cases. Near is really great for like taking one group of keywords and putting it next to the other group of keywords, like all kinds of appreciation keywords and putting them next to all the versions of the iPhone 4 and 5. So you take those 2 clusters and you near 20 of them together. Whereas if you're saying like, oh, I'm traveling to work today, but you want to match that phrase, or it's like traveling to my work, or it's traveling, or it's like traveling to work, or like traveling to work yesterday and today, then you can go ahead and take travel work today or traveling work today as the 3 keywords and add a little bit of flexibility in that phrase by saying, you know, for instance, tilde 3. And that basically just says to the system that they can remix the keywords with some extra spaces in between. And that's what we use it for deals exclusion as well. So hopefully that helps.
Great. And someone has asked us, Kristen has asked why we're seeing the Twitter egg in the profile pic in the test result. I'll just respond to that. So it's actually for speed reasons. Obviously, we're loading lots of test results so that you can quickly test your query, and to load in lots of the images would slow down the loading speed. But we are looking at improvements to our query builder at the moment, which might mean that we can include those images. Obviously, once you save your query, your results within the actual platform will have all the profile pictures. Nate, Aaron has asked, why didn't you use the wildcard operator, so that's the asterisk, for bank within your first chase query? I think you wrote bank or banking.
Yep, that's a great question. The answer is I should have done that. That's the better way to write the query. So that's a good point, which is that, yeah, you can very often take those wildcards and append them to even nouns or verbs like bank and banking, gets all the like banked, banks, etc. So that's how I probably would have done it. I just didn't want to introduce the wildcard right then and there. So that's a great point. The flip side of that is, of course, when you always get down to, if you think you're taking the K off banking, just as a thought experiment, you take the K off and you have just BAN, and you expect to get all the variations of banking anyway, it's going to get a bit crazier because you're also going to get ban, band, bans, banner. And so just remember that a wildcard is also a very powerful tool.
Alana has asked if we offer one-on-one training sessions to assist people with queries. Nate, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, definitely. So the one-on-one sessions for training for queries is definitely a possibility. We can do a training, we can do working sessions, we can scope those and schedule those. Very often we have people who have new team members coming on or want a refresher. We can book those repeatedly so that we always have something in the books, or we can do it a one-off thing as well. We do in-person training, and we do over obviously WebEx as well. So lots of different options. So just feel free to get in touch with us through, if you're in the US, through brains@brandwatch.com or through your account manager, and we'd be happy to set something up.
Great. Gemma, a couple of people asking about the county codes that you used in your London query. So someone's asked what the code stood for, which is the London county, and someone else has asked how those codes are, is every county in the UK assigned a grid number. Do you want to talk a bit about the location codes?
Yeah, so exactly that. Yeah, basically. So within our back-end system, we have locations that if somebody tweets and it has a geolocation attached to their tweet, then we can pin it down to a grid point, and then basically adding that then into your query string will then pick up people specifically from that location. Also, if they don't have a geolocation added to their tweet, then specifically from their phone, then we would also look at profile information, and if they have written, for example, that they're in London, then we would use that information as well to pin them down to that location.
Yeah, great. And it's worth noting that in the query builder, you can just search for the location you're looking for, whether that's a country or a town or a city or a county, and it will give you the correct code. So someone has also asked, Aaron has asked if you can use brackets with the new operators, so whether you could use brackets and say or and add additional handles or hashtags. And he's also asked whether you can also use the wildcard operators for those. Gemma, do you want to answer?
Yep, so yeah, definitely you can use the brackets, and so basically if you wanted to pick up several hashtags, then you would write hashtags with the colon, then open bracket, and then type in all the hashtags that you want to pick up with the or in between. So it's important that you include that, and then close off your brackets. So that definitely works. What I would say with the star operator is that sometimes with Twitter API, when you use it with other operators, it doesn't work as well. So I would say that to be on the safe side, just type in all the different hashtag operators rather than using the star in that case.
And one for you, Nate. Stefan has asked, obviously we mentioned earlier that you can only use raw on both sides of near. He's asked if there's any chance that in the future you'd be able to use near on one side.
Oh yeah, I think we can both answer that, which is to say, it's enormously. I think if I went back to our architecture team and asked them if they would turn pale. So it's more like I think it's sort of a fundamental limitation of the way that we do searching, but it is certainly intriguing because obviously when you run into situations like we were looking for a brand where the proper capitalization would help focus a lot, like Target, like we were looking at earlier. Mm-hmm. And then you don't want to actually obviously have to expand out those keywords on the other side. It is a thing that's important. So we can look into it, and maybe we'll just have to deal with some shocked faces.
Jeremy's asked if we could hear some tips for separating UK from US results, and especially with Facebook.
Yeah, so going for kind of colloquial terms is a good way of doing it. So different spellings for things, so excluding those, say, from your, if you wanted to look at specifically UK mentions on Facebook, for example, typing in some of the different spellings for things in American can get rid of it. Using like $sign as well, if you wanted to exclude some of the US data, that's quite a useful one to use. And just having a look through the results and seeing, are there kind of any users specifically that are in different locations and excluding those. So it does take time, unfortunately, but there are ways that you can do it to get your results more accurate to the location, specifically for where Facebook is always given location US. So we don't get any other granular data from Facebook other than location US. So when you are looking into that pot, it will always be location US unless you use these terms, colloquialisms, and so on to try and separate out the two.
Cool. Erica has asked, what does raw do? And Beatrice also asked, is raw still useful now that you don't need it for hashtags and app mentions? Gemma, do you want to answer?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, yeah, raw is still really, really useful in the case if you have a brand that uses a symbol in the name, which they're not as common, but like Sky Plus, for example, can get talked about, or Star Alliance as well, where that sometimes people use the star operator, the star symbol ahead of Alliance. What's important to note there is that if you actually want to pick up a special character that's also used as an operator, like star, which is the wildcard, the system won't pick it up with the raw if you just add it straight away, because it thinks it's an operator. But what you can do is add a backslash ahead of the star, and basically then that stops the system recognizing it as an operator, and it sees it as the symbol. So yeah, raw is definitely still useful. We won't need to use it as much because obviously we now have the hashtags and the app mentions operator. But yeah, I would say there's definitely lots of other cases where you will still need to use it.
Question for Nate. Tom has asked if within a query the special characters, if you're not using raw, are they treated as spaces? For example, if you wrote I've without the apostrophe, would that also be the same as searching for I've with the apostrophe?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is yes, that the system looks at them the same. So a way that we'll talk about it is how the Brandwatch search without using any of the raw or any of the other operators is capitalization and special character agnostic, which basically means that it will take any capitalization and match, and it will take any kind of special characters, dashes, underscores, commas, and it will treat them all the same. And so that just helps with when you're not looking for something specific. Just helps you just start with a basic keyword, and you don't have to worry about these variations. And of course, when you are doing that, the system is perfectly fine to take the apostrophe, but just so you know in the background that it is, in fact, it would match like a dash or an ampersand or a number of other things. Yeah, it's just useful, especially because from the perspective of knowing, like sometimes, like say Johnson and Johnson, JJ is also people's, can also J period can be somebody's initials, and J ampersand J is obviously the shortcut for Johnson and Johnson. So an example of that is being aware that the system will read, if you put J ampersand J into a query, the system will potentially read it as J period J and match some of that irrelevant content. Just so you're aware of how it works technologically. But obviously the solution for that is just to use raw to stipulate that the J should be capitalized and the ampersand shouldn't be a period, it should be an ampersand. So we've got a solution there.
Great. And final question, one for you, Gemma. Jane has asked, does the new app mentions operator pick up where it's just an at reply, so they directly replied, or whether they've just mentioned the Twitter handle within the tweet?
Yeah, good question. So it picks up both. So anywhere where someone has written in the tweet at and the Twitter handle, then it would pick that up. And if we want to pick up the Twitter handle itself, then where they're tweeting, then you would have to use the author operator, sorry.
Great, thank you. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. We've had quite a few. We will follow up with you via email if we haven't answered it in the session, or as I said, you can join us tomorrow for the Twitter Q&A and ask us there as well. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll be sending out this recording and the slides within a few days. Thank you.